My ex put a lie under oath and tried to take my children away from me. He sat in front of a judge and told a story about me that wasn't true, about neglect, about being unstable, about leaving the kids alone for hours. He said it with steady eyes and an easy smile. That hurt because those kids are my entire life, and because his false words were meant to erase me in front of them and in front of the law. We were in the middle of a custody hearing the morning he said it. The air in the courtroom smelled like cheap coffee and paper. He told the judge that I had abandoned our children, that I had gone out at night and come back drunk, that I was incapable of managing them. He said it in a way that sounded rehearsed. Later, when I watched the recording, I could hear the pauses he practiced. At the time, I only felt the floor drop beneath me, not just because custody was on the line, but because the people I loved most were listening from the gallery, thinking those words might be true. We separated 2 years before that hearing, legally separated for a year, and finally divorced 6 months later. The marriage had ended in pieces, not with fireworks, but with slow erosion. My ex, Daniel, had been the one with the steady income, the one with the corporate title, and the enviable savings accounts. I had left a job I liked when I had our first child. I wanted to be home, to make sure the schedule and the meals and the little illnesses were handled without another adult shifting blame at 2 a.m. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom in a split-level neighborhood, mortgage split, but payments slipping to me while he negotiated a raise and a transfer across the country. When he left for the new office, he promised increased support. He promised to take the kids on weekends. He promised we would communicate. Power imbalance is a bland phrase for what it felt like. He controlled the bank accounts. He controlled most of the scheduling and, for a while, the narrative. He had friends who were magistrates and a cousin who ran a local law firm. I had flexibility of presence. I was home. I was the one the kids came to when they scraped their knees, but not flexibility of means. I couldn't just walk away and start again. The mortgage, the preschool contracts, the medical co-pays, the school placement my daughter had finally settled into after moving twice. Leaving town would mean losing the community that mattered to the kids. It would mean making everyone start over. It would mean paying for daycare I couldn't afford and sacrificing the small constancies I'd built for them. So I stayed. I worked evenings as a freelance editor when the kids slept, cobbled together extra babysitting and tutoring to keep us afloat. I stayed because doing anything else felt like giving up on the life I had chosen for them. At first, his manipulations were small. He'd be consistently late in delivering child support, blaming HR, payroll, or some miscommunication. He missed pickups, then blamed traffic. He turned up at school events and left early, then complained about stage fright when parents talked. He started asking for more time with the kids on weeknights and then overnight on a whim. The requests were framed as concern. He talked about bonding and experiences, but he asked for more because it opened doors, more weekends, more control, and more subtle pressure on me to acquiesce. When I refused or pushed back, his tone changed. Calls became insistent. Texts came in at odd hours with veiled threats, not explicit, but the kind that sits between lines. If you make this difficult, I will have to take matters further. Once, when I asked for a clearer schedule in writing, he said, Don't make me use the court to get what I can already have. He made me feel petty and aggressive for wanting boundaries. I rationalized. I told myself lawyers are expensive and that I could mediate this. I thought compromise would preserve what really mattered, our children's steadiness. Then he started to weaponize the children themselves. It began with small things that looked innocent. He gave them expensive toys when they returned from his house, a subtle currency that bought smiles and loosened their loyalty at home. He told them stories that painted him as the adventurer and me as the tired caretaker. Dad knows how to fix things, he'd say, meaning lawnmowers and leaky sinks, but the unspoken line was clear. He's the one who can provide, who can do, who can lead. He would bring up school schedules with a tone that implied I wasn't attending to details, a way of implying incompetence without saying it outright. The escalations came in waves. First, he said I was unreliable. He caught an editor's deadline or two late because of an illness and used that as evidence of chaos. Then he added accusations. She left the kids alone, he told a co-worker. She sleeps during the day. A neighbor who had never seen me with a drink on my lips was asked to sign a statement that they had seen me out late. Small people with small loyalties would say small things that, when collected, looked like a pattern. At home, the pressure pushed me into tighter corners. I started hot-checking all doors and locks at night, waking to the smallest sound. I stopped leaving the kids alone in the backyard for a minute to fetch groceries. I built my life around minimizing opportunities for him to make anything look bad. It was exhausting. It was humiliating to have to disguise the routines of parenting into legally defensible acts. Friends tried to advise me. Get a lawyer, my sister said. Record things. My sister was blunt in a way that was both helpful and bruising. If he's playing dirty, stop playing clean. Financially, I couldn't afford a high-profile lawyer. Legal aid was stretched thin, and the lawyers who worked for cheap had long caseloads and slow replies. I tried mediation, then formal channels, then a private investigator who promised to collect what you can't. That investigator suggested surveillance, explained the rules and the limits, and gave me a camera system that he said complied with local laws. Keep it in common areas, he said. Don't put it in bedrooms or bathrooms. Make sure the files are time stamped. Don't edit anything. I followed instructions with the kind of precision that felt like armor. The first footage I ever watched from that hidden cam was mundane. The kids playing with blocks, the afternoon light slanting across the living room rug. It felt like a theft, like I was watching a memory in another person's hands. The cam sat on a shelf that faced the front door and the living room where the kids often ate snacks and did puzzles. It recorded audio. It recorded small truths. I told myself I wasn't trying to catch anyone, just trying to gather facts. But I also knew why we had it, to show patterns if he tried to twist them. The escalations that followed were not dramatic in a movie sense. They were slow, legalistic, grinding. He filed a motion for temporary custody, claiming there was an immediate risk to the children. He said I had left the kids unsupervised for hours on multiple occasions. He said I had refused his attempts at co-parenting. He filed witness affidavits from a babysitter he had hired, a woman I had only seen twice, who swore I had been unreliable. The affidavits were neat and typed, the kind of evidence that seems solid because it comes on letterhead and in a font that looks like seriousness. In court, the first day was about procedural things, schedules, temporary orders, Who had what contact? The judge's voice was weary. He asked for specifics and dates. My ex's lawyer produced a calendar with red X's and circled weekends. It felt like watching a slow, methodical dismantling of the reality I lived in. Each piece of supposed evidence was a new tooth knocked out from the mouth of my life. I listened, my hands in my lap, my face calm because my kids were watching and I did not want them to see me break. My reaction was to gather. I collected school attendance records, the signed notes from doctors, the play dates where other mothers could verify I had been present. I kept every bank transfer and message that showed late child support payment dates and excuses. But it wasn't enough. He had money for lawyers, he had a story, and stories, especially well-told ones, often outweigh messy records in a judge's chamber when the judge has to make a quick decision about what's best for children. The court called an emergency hearing one rainy afternoon. He sat there and told the story again. He painted me as negligent and erratic. He said our son had spent nights at a sitter's house for weeks, alone on a schedule he couldn't recall. He said our daughter had once been locked in a bedroom without care. He said there were people who would testify that I drank. He indicated that my fatigue, a real physical fatigue of single parenting through nights and freelance deadlines, was the equivalent of substance abuse. He used the children's needs as leverage. It felt like bribing the judge with worry. The low point was not a single moment, but a cluster of small humiliations that converged. The judge issued a temporary order, 2 weeks of shared custody with supervised handoffs. It said in plain language that for now, the children's best interest required stability and oversight. I read the typed words and felt a cold, slow grief like a room being closed. The kids were to go with him on alternating nights, and handoffs would occur at a supervised exchange centre. The order didn't say I was unfit, but the effect was the same. Overnight contact would be limited. My presence in their day-to-day life would be reduced. The narrative in the official record tilted in his favour. At home, there was a small, close moment of abandonment. Our son, aged 8, asked me quietly if I was going away. Our daughter, 10, insisted that she wasn't scared, that she could handle it. They were brave in the way children often are when they don't want to add to their parents' worry. I cried alone after they went to bed, not in big tears, but in a tired, steady leak that carried the weight of fear and humiliation. The cameras kept recording. That night I watched footage. I had to. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and clicked through files with dates and times. The camera had recorded the handoffs, the whispered conversations, the moments when Daniel would come without warning, sweep the kids up with the practiced warmth of a man who knows how to be photographed with a child on his lap. The footage also caught things he did not expect to be useful later. A conversation with his sister, a laughing exchange in the kitchen where he spoke too freely. I kept looking for something that would change the balance, something that wasn't just me saying I was present, but something that showed he had manufactured testimony or coached the kids or left them in danger. I kept finding little things that felt like truth. The kids bouncing on the couch, the way he joked about winning in court, but had no legal heft on their own. Then I found the file that would become the pivot. It was a clip from a Saturday afternoon when Daniel had come by for a visit that turned into a supervised exchange after an argument with a neighbour. The video showed him kneeling on the living room rug, talking to our son with that slow, conspiratorial kindness adults use when they're trying to coach a child. He told him, "If the judge asks, you say mom left you alone sometimes. Just say it like you remember it, okay?" It wasn't long, but the camera captured the cadence, the instruction, the small bribe of a cookie he offered as he spoke. Our son looked uneasy, but nodded. Later in the clip, Daniel mimicked phrases, shaping how the child should tell the story. I watched that clip in the blue light of dawn and felt my stomach drop to a place below my bones. I felt something else too, cold clarity. This was a crime against the kid's truth, against their memory of me. He was manufacturing evidence by instructing them how to speak. That was when I understood the nature of his plan, ownership by narrative. If he could make everyone believe he had been their constant and I their absence, the paperwork would follow. I didn't immediately go to the police. I called my sister, who came over within an hour with a lawyer she had once worked with. We watched the clip together in a room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and my sister's jaw clenched in the way it does when she moves into protector mode. The lawyer said the footage might be admissible, but cautioned that family court takes a certain view of recordings and a certain view of children. He told us to preserve metadata, to not alter files, to get certified copies. He also said something I had needed to hear, that children can be coached, and evidence like this matters. It could, if properly handled, change the direction of the case. We took the steps exactly as advised. We made copies. We had a digital forensics expert confirm timestamps and that the files were not edited. We prepared a brief that would show not only the coaching, but also other suspicious behavior. Texts from Daniel discussing witnesses, receipts for the babysitter he had hired, who later gave an affidavit against me, and a calendar he had used to track issues with the children. We worked quietly, not because we wanted to hide, but because the court's gears creak slower when noise is high. We wanted a clean, sober presentation. The next hearing was a cagey thing. His lawyer tried to preempt the footage by saying recordings are unreliable, that children are impressionable, that I had set a trap. My hands felt clammy as I listened. Daniel did not look at me. He looked like a man who had practiced stoicism for court battles. The judge listened. He has a face that doesn't give much away. Small eyes, a mouth that seems built to chew words and let them out in measured bites. When our lawyer asked for the footage to be entered as evidence, Daniel's lawyer objected on privacy grounds, on the grounds of leading the children. There was a back and forth that made the room feel smaller. Each word a wedge. The turning point was not a blow, but a slow peeling back of layers until the truth was visible. The forensics expert testified about the timestamps, about the audio waveforms that showed edits would be evident. Our children's therapist, we had involved one after the temporary order, testified about signs of coaching, the way vocabulary shifted, the way details seemed repeated verbatim. The babysitter's affidavit was shown to contain language strikingly similar to the phrases Daniel used. The babysitter later admitted under cross-examination that she had been asked leading questions by him before signing. Most importantly, we were allowed to play the clip of him talking to our son. I watched his mouth form each sentence he had told the child to say. I watched his hand reach for a cookie as if it were a bribe, simple and grotesque. The judge paused the video, then asked Daniel under oath about the conversation. He denied coaching. He said he had been trying to prepare the child for court, that he was concerned. His voice showed a slip, a small laugh where he had meant seriousness. The judge's face tightened. The tenor of the room changed. When someone under oath looks shaky, it creates an opening. The credibility that had anchored his whole attempt began to list. Consequences came in realistic, legal increments rather than dramatic fireworks. The judge did not shout or slam his gavel. He issued orders and asked for clarifications. He expressed concern about coaching and the integrity of testimony. He ordered the children to be interviewed separately by a court-appointed child advocate with experience in custody cases, a neutral professional to assess the children's statements free from parental influence. He also adjusted the temporary custody arrangement. For the moment, overnight stays were limited and supervised by an independent agency. Daniel's visitation would continue, but under stricter conditions and with mandated parenting classes. The judge flagged the possibility of referring the matter for perjury investigation. In plain language, that meant real consequences could follow if further evidence showed deliberate falsehoods. Daniel's life did not implode, nor did mine suddenly become ideal. He pushed back, hired a new lawyer, and continued to make moves within legal bounds. He contested each order. In the weeks that followed, there were depositions and more hearings and long, dry motions about admissibility and relevance. The small escalations continued, new affidavits, text messages presented as exhibits. But with each round, his narrative's foundation seemed less steady. The footage had not turned a courtroom into a moral theatre. It had simply introduced a piece of demonstrable fact that made judges and professionals ask different questions. There were also personal costs. The kids sat through interviews that were clinical and invasive in their way. They were questioned about what they remembered, what phrases they had heard, and where they had been on certain dates. It was necessary, but it left a quiet strain in their eyes. My son became guarded for a while, as if memory itself had been touched. My daughter, older, asked pointed questions about ethics and why anyone would lie. They both mourned the normalcy that had been broken, the messy, imperfect life of a family that argued sometimes but came together more often. I mourned a version of parenthood that is uncomplicated by legalism and suspicion. Financially, I was drained. The process had not been cheap. I took freelance work that left my sleep ragged and my patience thin. I leaned on friends and my sister. I took advantage of every support program I could find and learned to be precise in my bookkeeping, because records matter in these fights. That pragmatism cost me softness. There were evenings I sat on the floor of the closet with a mug and went through accounts and payment histories, feeling like a small clerk turning pages of my life. Emotionally, the wake of betrayal extended in backward and forward directions. Backward, in the sense that I recalled small betrayals I had glossed over earlier, the way he had minimized parenting, the way he had insisted on arrangements that favored him financially. Forward, because the consequences of the court's decisions would shape the children's childhoods in ways I couldn't completely control. The camera had not erased those losses. It had simply created a lever. He continued to try to manipulate. There was a moment when he drove by the school before pickup and stood watching from across the street, phone in hand. Another time, he tried to introduce a new babysitter without my consent and insisted the kids might like someone new. He complained publicly on social media, posting vague messages about the system and protecting his rights. painting himself as a wronged father. Some mutual friends slipped away, uncomfortable with the rift. People choose sides in ways that are quiet and cutting. He called my parenting chaotic, which felt like another round of the same old tactic. Make the other parent look like the source of instability, and you become the refuge by contrast. The court hearings dragged into months, the child's advocate's reports, the forensics confirmation, and the pattern of coaching culminated in a later hearing where the judge's tone had shifted to one of guarded skepticism about Daniel's claims. He was not sanctioned for everything, but his credibility had been damaged. The judge's final order for the case, not a dramatic declaration, but a careful, plainly written ruling, emphasized joint responsibility, a supervised transition plan, mandatory parenting counseling for Daniel, and a clear structure for exchanges. It also ordered both parents to provide copies of communications through a shared app to reduce misunderstandings. The judge thanked the child's advocate and recommended a follow-up in 6 months. We did not win in some triumphant sense. The ruling did not dissolve the hurt or the fact that our lives had been rearranged. Daniel continued to have substantial contact with her children, and rightly so. He is their father. He loved them in his way, and taking that away would have been as wrong as letting a lie stand. The consequence that mattered most was that the court recognized the attempt to manipulate their testimony and acted to reduce the risk of influence. It was a practical correction rather than a vindictive reversal. There were also personal consequences for Daniel. His public image within our small town cooled. Some of his professional contacts asked awkward questions. His brother stopped posting family photos on holidays. Those things are not justice and they are not exile, but they were a mirror. For me, there was relief that the children's testimony, the truth of their lives, could be unclouded by someone else's script. That relief was not triumphant, it was pragmatic and heavy. The low point had forced me toward a kind of quiet decision-making I hadn't expected. I learned to protect what mattered in ways that didn't feel like living in a bunker, but felt like building a safe room. I learned to keep careful records and to be precise in language. I stopped forgiving small manipulations as just stress or just being protective. I stopped assuming that silence would preserve the kids. I put my own dignity into a format the court could understand. Dates, times, recordings, receipts. It was an odd commodification of love, but it worked. In the months after the ruling, everyday life returned in its uneven way. The kids settled into the schedule the judge had outlined. Daniel attended the parenting classes, though he did so with what I would call reluctant participation. He showed up physically and sometimes remarkably behaved as if he were learning. Sometimes he did not. There were days when his texts were apologetic and days when he tried a sharp turn back into manipulation. The relationship between us became strictly transactional and often cold in the margins. We spoke about pickup times, not feelings. At home, the cameras stayed for a while longer. Not because I wanted to spy forever, but because I had learned that truth sometimes had to be preserved formally before it could be allowed to simply exist. There were nights when I turned off all the lights and watched the children sleep and felt that small, human tenderness that is uncompromised by legal fights. They looked untouched by the tangle of adult deceit. They looked like children who deserved normalcy. I became better at giving them that within the constraints we had. One quiet consequence that surprised me was how the experience altered my sense of self-worth in a practical way. I used to measure myself by what I sacrificed for the kids, by the nights spent awake, by the lunches packed. After the court, I learned to include in that measurement the ability to hold boundaries, to gather evidence when necessary, to say no to someone who tried to weaponize narrative. It's not an elegant growth, but it was necessary. I became more guarded, but also more assertive in the ways a parent must be when children's welfare is at stake. Some friendships frayed, others deepened. My sister became a constant, a steady presence who will say blunt things and then drive across town at midnight with a gallon of coffee. My kids' school counselors were practical, no-nonsense allies who helped me understand how to hold conversations with my children about truth and memory without turning therapy into a second courtroom. There were counselors who explained how children can be influenced and how to repair trust without inducing shame. Those were small, essential tools. There were moments I resented all of it. I resented that I had to turn my life into paperwork. I resented that my children's childhood became subject to lawyers and hearings. I resented the way intimacy with my kids was occasionally interrupted by the need to be cautious. But I also learned to be careful without being fearful. I learned to teach my children about boundaries in a way that felt natural. How to say no, how to speak truth, how to notice when someone asks them to repeat words that feel strange. When the court asked for a 6-month review, I prepared thoroughly. We had documentation of compliance with orders, records of parenting classes, and notes from the child's advocate. The review was quiet. The judge asked a few pointed questions and then closed the file with a clear expectation that the family would follow through on the plan. He did not lecture or moralize. The relief I felt was practical. The court had recognized a problem and had made a measured, enforceable plan. It felt like a small, legalized restoration of balance. Several intimate, private things also changed. I stopped counting on his silence as a measure of civility. I started keeping a separate savings account in my name and moved a portion of my freelance earnings into it. I expanded my professional work slowly, taking on editing contracts that allowed evening hours but paid enough to build a buffer. Not long after the 6-month review, I enrolled in an online certification that would broaden my career options. It was a quiet assertion rather than a desperate escape plan, a way to ensure that if the pattern reemerged, I would have more power to respond. Our kids healed in ways I could not always see. There were days when my son would curl up on the couch and tell me about an episode of a show and laugh, and I would feel the tension lift. My daughter returned to drawing and began entering small art contests at school. They were children first, not legal subjects. They went to sleepovers, had friends, and asked me about mundane things like whether carrots could be used in cake. Those were the things that mattered in the end. I do not imagine that Daniel and I will ever be friends. We share custody of memories and a set of logistics. If anything, the case hardened him in his ways and made me harder in mine. But the big thing that changed was the context within which our children grow up. A structure that aims, imperfectly, to protect them from adults who might put their interests behind personal gain. If there's any single truth I hold now, it's that truth matters in small, recordable ways. A recording, a timestamp, a pattern can make a difference. The hidden camera did not create justice by some cinematic logic. It provided a tool that allowed the system to ask different questions. It gave me a way to show rather than only to plead. That was the turning point. The recognition that truth can sometimes be packaged and presented so it is difficult to ignore. The ending is quiet. There is no grand unmasking, no cinematic reckoning where everyone claps. There are instead ordinary mornings where I make cereal and check backpacks and sign permission slips. There are afternoons when the kids do homework at the table and I help with multiplication problems. We have routines, dance class on Tuesdays, piano on Thursdays, grocery shopping on Saturday mornings. The hidden cam sits in a drawer now, its purpose fulfilled. I have the copies of the files in a secure place and the knowledge that if we ever need them again, they exist. I am cautious, yes, but also calm in a practical way. I still get anxious when the phone rings with an unknown number, and there are days I replay the trial in the margins of my mind, but mostly I have learned to impose structure where there was chaos before. Clear schedules, agreed upon exchange locations, a shared app for communication. Those things do not erase betrayal. They reduce the opportunities for it. They give the children a predictable rhythm that belongs to them, rather than to adult drama. If you're watching this because you're worried about someone trying to rewrite your story with your kids, I'm not here to offer platitudes. I am here to say that careful action matters. Keep records, document dates and times. Seek legal counsel even when it feels like an impossible expense. Ask for support. And remember that children often prefer stability and truth over spectacle. The court may not be a moral arbiter, but it can be a place where documented fact weighs against fabricated stories. If anything in this sounds familiar, leave a like if it helped you feel less alone. If you want more stories about how to navigate custody and family conflicts, subscribe for more. And if you have been through something similar, will you share below how you handled a moment when someone tried to rewrite your children's history?